Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money in the home as a team. Today, we welcome Birthsmarter Founder Ashley Brichter. Ashley is a lifelong educator, birth worker, consultant, and entrepreneur. She is a Certified Fair Play Facilitator, a Tory Burch Fellow, and she sits on the board of ProNatal Fitness. In this episode, we will explore the challenges couples face during childbirth, emphasizing its unpredictability and impact on relationships. She highlights postpartum mental health, fair play for shared parenting, and provides practical advice of support. Enjoy the episode. Wow, we are thrilled to have Ashley Brichter of Birthsmarter here for today's podcast to talk about all things birthing, from the moments of birth, the months that lead into it, and then the months that followed. So if you are at that point in your life or know someone who is, where you're experiencing this, much like our co-host Christian, who could not join us because he is on paternity leave, his wife just gave birth, then please share this episode with them. We have a wonderful expert for our conversation today. Ashley, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So how did you become so passionate about supporting couples through childbirth and the early stages of parenting?
I think that it started when I was very young, to be honest. I was just sort of hashing this out with someone else that I work with and realizing that even when I was maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, I always knew that I loved being around babies. But I was always drawn to paying attention to the parents. When my aunt delivered one of my cousins, I remember thinking about her. I remember thinking about her, which I don't think is something a lot of young kids do. It's like you're thinking about yourself, right? That's how childhood works.
Yeah.
But I think the icing on the cake, for better or worse, was that my parents got divorced when I was 7. And because of that, because there's so much intentionality in terms of what custody looks like and how much I'm hanging out with my mom versus my dad, and conversations they would have and vulnerabilities they would share, I had this the curtain was pulled back a little bit, and I was like, oh, you're not just my mom and my dad. You are also these human beings having this experience. And that's weird. And a little bit, I don't really want to see that. And a little bit, I was so intrigued. And I think that there are just some people who are born onto this planet who have this way of holding space for others, even if there are huge age gaps. And so as a very young person at 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, I was somebody that people were comfortable talking to, and I was someone who didn't feel burdened by listening to stories and upset. And so I wanted to put all of that together somehow. I thought for years and years, through graduating from college, that I was going to be a classroom teacher, because with this sort of gift and predisposition, it meant that, I should just work with kids, and women work with kids by being a school teacher. And I couldn't nail what I wanted to teach. So I wound up going through college and getting a teaching certification. And I taught preschool, middle school, high school. I wound up certifying in secondary social studies, but knew that sort of teaching about, the Civil War or the Cold War, whatever it was not it was not igniting passion. And I come from a very entrepreneurial family. And so it was just sort of gifted this incredible Venn diagram of I really want to help people. I really want to think about families and babies. I really want to listen to stories. I care that the world is a better place. And a lot of stars aligned when I was I'll just work for myself and figure out how to make money, which grew into collecting certifications in the birth space and doula space and childbirth educator space, and have carved out a career for myself that I did not know existed.
Wow, what an awesome journey. Even just from a young age, you were clearly very insightful and just continued that all the way up. That's awesome. And I know our listeners are going to be very thankful for all the advice you give. And I know all the people you've worked with are obviously very thankful. So this is just so awesome to have you on today. let's kind of like, let's just start with some of the like more difficult stuff. So like, what are the common challenges couples face during childbirth? And then how can we prepare to really tackle these together, as a team?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest challenge that couples face is the fact that you're sort of walking into the unknown, right? And in a culture that loves being in control and loves being prepared,
Yes.
childbirth and parenting is like, you know,
Terrifying.
terrifying. It's terrifying. You're throwing like these
The
like
fear of the unknown.
yeah, the fear of the unknown is terrifying. The fear of and the way that we're all, to group all of us into one big generation, like we are told to work really hard to be able to be in charge and have a life that is predictable. And especially, I know we want to talk about mental health later, but like especially where your mental health is sort of dependent on like controlling the controllables. It's like, hey, you can't do that when you're going to have a kid.
Wait,
So I think that's the biggest challenge.
so Ashley, you're saying that babies and young children and childbirth, they're not predictable.
I'm saying they're not predictable. Yeah, spoiler alert. So I think that that's the biggest challenge. And I think that what we do at Birthsmarter and what I figured out is to address that in a pretty cool way. Because a lot of people that I know sort of hide in the face of being terrified by the unpredictability. They're like, okay, well, I'm gonna do it, but I don't want to face it head on because it's too tricky. And what we do is we try to not sort of teach parents the basics, because the basics are very much like, here's a recipe to follow. And the recipe only works if you have all the right ingredients and your oven is working and your fridge is plugged in and all of that, right? Like we've all been in that situation where you're like, I'm going to make this thing. And then you're like, well, the baking soda is bad or the milk is bad or I don't actually have any flour. So what we do instead, there's a cookbook for anybody who knows this. There's a cookbook called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Samin Nosrat. There was also a show on Netflix, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And that's how we think about sort of birth and parenting preparation is you've got to let go of the idea that there's a recipe, that there's some amount of like controllability, and you've got to learn what your core elements are that you're working with and master those core elements and then be able to like whip up whatever you need in the moment. So the core elements are, really getting in touch with your instincts and understanding the difference between instincts and anxiety. That's huge. Another core element is healthy communication. And learning how to talk to each other, especially when you're sleep deprived and stressed and really anxious because the stakes feel really, really high. Another element is learning how to make decisions when you're just genuinely like not, either you don't have all the information because you don't have access to it, or you don't have all the information because the world doesn't have all the information, right? And so you're sort of like, I feel like a lot of parenting and birth preparation is that you're going to the library and you're like, let me get a book on this to learn, but like there are none. They just don't exist.
Yeah.
Or the librarian's like, oh, we'll read this one instead. And you're like, well, I came here to learn about lions and you're giving me a book about house cats. And they're like, yeah, it's close enough. And so then you make all your decisions about lions based on house cats, but that's not the same thing, right? So we're really struggling in this world where we just like don't have a depth of good content to pull from. And in particular, and something I think a lot about for fatherhood, is that the content doesn't need to come from experts and scientists writing. The content in birth and parenting comes from our communities and this idea of having elders and mentors. And that is something that we know is really missing for our generation, is being close to, like deeply close to and vulnerable with the people around you who came before you, your uncles, your fathers, your grandfathers. Whereas for moms, we do have a lot of that, not enough, but we do have a lot of it.
I still remember attending the is it Lamaze classes? Is that? Talk about an enormous waste of time. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, because if you go to birthsmarter.com, you can find lots of information on Ashley and her company and what they focus on. Because ultimately, if you've been through this process, like in retrospect, I should have figured out like this is dumb before I went there because it's just counting to 8 when you breathe or whatever it is. Like the real advice is things like I gave Christian before he went on paternity leave, before his wife gave birth, like take cards or a board game, because it's not like the movies. In most cases, I have 3 kids. In 2 of the cases, it was not like the movies where they like rush in and the water's already broken. There's a baby popped out and like everything's done within 7 minutes. It like my wife's, one of her deliveries was like 20 some hours. So you're literally trying to figure out, how can I help my wife take her mind off the pain of this just extraordinary process? Board games, card games. Like that's just like one little example that means a heck of a lot more to me than, okay, we're going to breathe in now, we're going to breathe out now. So anyhow, had to interject that. Dr. Ross, I know you have it. No, go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, can I? So here's what I want to say, because the secret sauce of what we do at Birthsmarter is we make humans, right? Men, women, expectant fathers, or professionals, whatever, we make humans understand how awesome giving birth is. And that's what's missing from any classic childbirth ed. So I want to take 2 seconds and walk you through this. In order for a human being to have a baby, 3 things need to happen physiologically, and only 3 things. The uterus, this amazing muscular organ, which is very similar to the heart, right? We all appreciate our heart. It's pumping, it's made up of smooth muscle, can't live without it. The uterus is awesome. We just don't pay attention to it. The uterus is going to contract and contract and contract, right? We need uterine contractions in order to push a baby down.
Okay.
You need the cervix, which is, imagine you got a wine bottle, right? The uterus is the wine bottle, flip it upside down. The cervix is the neck of the wine bottle. And that's like, okay, a little bit of wine can come out, but you know what? If we pulled the neck of the wine bottle out of the way, a whole lot of wine could come out. So we need the cervix to get really soft. Everybody who's ever taken a Lamaze class or any other childbirth ed knows that you need a cervix to dilate. Everybody's talking about dilation. Dilation is a side effect, and it is a distraction, and it is something where we've been like culturally steered wrong. When we think about the cervix opening, we don't understand why or how that's happening. So what you actually want is for the cervical tissue in the human body to go from feeling like the tip of your nose, which is collagen tissue, it's pretty firm, to the inside of your cheek. It gets really, really soft and really, really stretchy. When it gets soft and stretchy and the uterus contracts, it pulls the cervix up and out of the way. And it doesn't just like disappear, the cervix. The uterus recruits the cervical tissue so that the top of the uterus, which is called the fundus, gets really thick and really, really more muscular and more powerful with every contraction. The more of the cervix that's recruited to the top of the uterus, the more we're building the fundus. And then here's what we create. And this is what I say in every class I teach. We're creating the magic red button in the Batman car. You know, the button in the car where you press it and then you go, but the whole movie, they're like, don't press it, don't press it, don't press it. And then at that like heightened tension, right? So that, when the fundus is big and thick and strong and powerful, you create what's called the fetal ejection reflex, which is there your uterus is just like, choo, baby comes out. Okay.
Oh, man.
So you need the uterus to contract, you need the cervix to get soft in order for it to get pulled out of the way. And then we need our baby to rotate in order for when that fetal ejection reflex hits, the baby's in a good position to get out, because the pelvis is complicated and it's a little bit like parallel parking. Like you got to get the angle right. So when you understand that that's how babies are born, then you can say, great, how do we help that process? And how do we help that process, whether you're having a home birth or a hospital birth, whether you're induced or you're going into labor on your own, and whether, you know, you or your wife chooses to get an epidural or not, because the interventions, again, are like a distracting part of the conversation. The awesomeness is like how it works. And so in order for uterine contractions to happen, you need to feel calm and safe and trusting, because oxytocin is our love, bonding, cuddle hormone. If you're scared or tense, you can't produce a ton of oxytocin. In order for your cervix to get soft, you need the baby to be in a good position. In order for the baby to rotate, the maternal body needs to be moving around, because you've got essentially a cookie stuck in a cookie jar. So it's like a shake and shimmy process. So what we do for partners is like, hey, it could be really boring, like seriously hours of just like, you
Yeah.
want to twiddle your thumbs, right? Or tap out and probably get a doula and let the doula do a lot of work while you go get coffee. But, partners understanding the physiology, what we say is you only have 5 jobs, right? You are the keeper of oxytocin. She's got to produce it, but you've got to keep it going. What does that look like? It looks like shutting the lights off. It looks like shutting the door. It looks like saying to the like brand new baby resident, hey, we don't need any help right now, please leave. Or like, you know how many times I've been at a birth and a maintenance worker has come in to fix the TV in the labor and delivery room, and you're like, now is not a good time for us, like, you
Oh,
can leave.
no. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
yeah, right? Because they're at work and you're having a baby, and like, that's so you got to keep up the oxytocin. You got to whisper the sweet nothings or give them massages or whatever is your language, right? Make her feel really, really safe and comfortable. You have to fuel the uterus by, we call it being the alpha breather. So instead of, okay, count to 8, right? Or worse is like, hey, breathe, breathe, babe, relax, relax, breathe, right? Which
Oh, I
is
didn't
like,
do that. That'd get me slapped.
so what we want you to do is breathe. Breathe in the way that you can take big deep breaths in, big deep breaths out, control your own oxytocin, right? And in that, you are basically, you're keeping the beat of the room. You're the metronome. You are the person that she's going to look at, and like, you're going to be so steady, and she is going to remember to fuel this muscle that is contracting and contracting and contracting, right? The inside of her body is running a marathon. The outside of her body might be laying in a bed, but the inside of her body is running a marathon. So we need oxygen. We need hydration. You're the chief hydration officer. That's what we came up with. You got to keep it moving. You got to help that baby rotate. So every 30 to 60 minutes, say, hey, babe, let's try a new position, right? This is what we learned in class. Let's get up, walk around, turn over, left side, right side, whatever. And then you're the logistics manager. So you're making sure, and Seth Meyers, for anybody listening, if you haven't watched Seth Meyers' comedy special on Netflix called Lobby Baby, he teaches, like, it's like we asked him to write a lecture for dads on what it means to be the logistics manager, insofar as he did every single thing wrong. So I highly recommend that. Basically, logistics means have your doctor's phone number in your phone, have the address of the hospital in your maps already, do the dry run, make sure that you are like on point with the insurance forms, with the registration, all of that stuff, because the marathon she's running in her body is making it so she shouldn't have to think about any of those things. And when you have that framework, Brian, you're not like, oh, I'm sort of bored. You're like, oh my God, I'm so empowered. I have so many things to do. Almost like, can it take longer because I didn't get to do all my jobs yet?
Well, first of all, you need to be the 911 of birthing, because I would have called you, like, particularly the first birth. I was absolutely terrified. We were both like 22, 23. I didn't know what was going on, man. And then I looked down there and it was, I almost passed out. Like, I literally got lightheaded. And I think like, as you were describing that, I'm not joking. I started to get lightheaded again. I started to think about that because it is, I know it's beautiful and I'm supposed to say those things, but if you've never seen the whole process, oh my goodness. Now, by the third time on the way there, I was like, hey babe, can I go through the drive-through at McDonald's before we go to the hospital? I'm like, you've kind of gone through it a couple of times, but everything that you just said, because you understand what is going on with their bodies and what you need to do to help their bodies give birth, makes a heck of a lot more sense than telling someone, time to breathe, babe. Like, that is exactly what we were looking for, in this episode, for people who are going through this process or about to go through this process. And look at Bruce. He's just decided they're not going to have children.
Well, I love the passion you bring to this, Ashley. And like, I love all the analogies and like the roles and stuff that like you're explaining this process so well.
Yeah.
I feel like, and really laying out like why it's so important for partners to be, like, both partners to be just so actively involved during the process.
Yeah, I think that there's two things. One is that we have known the history of birth is a whole nother episode. The history of birth in the United States is very, very complicated, but the Cliff Notes version is that women primarily gave birth around other women in out of hospital settings before there were big hospitals. And most of the time, birth works really, really well. Starting in the late 1800s, birth moved from the home to the hospital. Obstetricians got really involved, and we started sort of applying assembly line thinking into medicine and into birth. We started really leaning on medical interventions, and we started taking sort of the power and the flexibility away from individuals. And in that process, women experienced more pain, and the more pain led to more fear, the more fear led to more pain, and there's this really negative cycle where when you're really scared, when you're feeling a lot of pain, you can't produce that oxytocin. The physiology of birth is not meant to flourish. And so for basically 230 years, women in the United States have been giving birth with their hands tied behind their back, figuratively. And so in the 1940s, we started seeing a pushback to that through the 1970s, 80s, where a lot of times women weren't even allowed to have their partners in the room with them, right? That's how it started. You were in the hands of labor and delivery nurses and male obstetricians being told what to do or being drugged. And as women were sort of learning coping techniques from Europe or developing new childbirth education practices or learning ancestral knowledge, right, they were saying, this is not what we want. And some people in the 1970s literally handcuffed themselves to their male partners, right, their husband, saying, he's coming in the room with me, I'm not doing this alone, because I both want the support, but also because I need an advocate in this system. Right. And so there's actually deep weight to the trust and the sort of like counter messaging of having, if you have a male obstetrician and if you are as a woman giving birth feeling sort of the heaviness of the patriarchy and sexism, having your male partner come in and be an advocate for you brings so much peace and calm to the room. And it's one of the biggest reasons that I love when we teach expectant fathers who are lawyers or doctors themselves, because it's like, oh, you're good, you're comfortable in this room, like you don't have to work on your presence and your advocacy. So there's a huge element of teaching expectant fathers about birth so that they can help create an environment in which their wife feels safe and comfortable and can have a positive experience. But the other piece is as important, if not more important for me, and I think it's one of the differentiators between Birthsmarter's classes and any other classes, is that we also really care that you are having a baby. Like, this isn't just about you supporting your wife. This is about you welcoming your kid into the world, and how do you want to feel as a dad while that's happening? What do you want to know about the story you're creating for these first moments of like, and then this is what it was like for me to be a dad when you were being born. And like, this is how I was a dad the first hour after you were born, because you have what our society, I think, does not make any room for, certainly not enough room, is just dads being dads, right? You have this a relationship with your kid totally separate from your partner.
I never once and was told that. For 3 children, there was never one comment or person who told us that I should have a thought pattern like that. There should be any care toward the father ever.
I mean, it makes me want to cry, and I think that it goes back to my parents getting divorced. It goes back to being able to look at my dad and being like, I don't think people are taking care of you. And when I gave birth for the first time in 2014, I developed very severe internal bleeding and was rushed into emergency surgery. And I had 7 people waiting for me, and my husband was completely alone. And I was like, hey, that's pretty terrifying. Like, how did our whole family who really loves him just not support him? Like, what is happening that we are totally dropping men here? And that's like a huge thing that we want to address.
As a Modern Husbands podcast listener, you recognize the importance of evidence-based advice from leading national experts for your marriage. That's why we know you will love our marriage toolkit. Nearly 50 national experts came together to provide bite-sized advice to manage the toughest topics couples face in managing money in the home as a team. Go to modernhusbands.com for your free preview of our marriage toolkit to start, strengthen, or rebuild your marriage. Once again, that's modernhusbands.com to sign up for your free preview of our marriage toolkit. Now back to the show.
Well, I mean, I think this kind of leads into the next question of like, can you discuss some of the emotional and psychological impacts of childbirth on couples' relationships and how they can strengthen that bond then during this time?
Yeah, I think that, it touches everything. It touches your relationship with your body for both of you, like definitely more so for the person who's getting pregnant, but sleep deprivation and changing schedules is like your relationship with your body and your hormones is complicated. The relationship with your body, the relationship with your mental health, like, are you going to see that you're calmer? Are you going to see that you're more anxious, more overwhelmed? That's more typical. And we know that, postpartum mood and anxiety disorders are affecting men in huge ways and we're not paying attention to them. The one practical thing I will say here is that postpartum depression and anxiety looks very, very different for postpartum moms as it does for postpartum dads. For moms, you see a lot more classic, like sort of, spiraling thoughts or obsessive behaviors. And depression will look in a classic way, like, not being able to get out of bed, not being able to take a shower, moving slowly through your day. For dads, we often see postpartum depression and anxiety show up as totally throwing themselves into a not baby related project. Basically there's an avoidance behavior. And an example of this is someone we know who had like a 2-week-old baby, like your colleague, and decided to refinish their porch. And it was like, okay, that doesn't make sense objectively as where you should be spending your time. But he was having such a hard time sort of connecting to the baby and understanding his role. And so that's just an example of that. But so physical health, mental health, the combination of those is going to touch intimacy. And I think that's a huge conversation for couples to have ahead of time. One of the ways that we sort of talk about that is, mainstream culture says you can just have sex 6 weeks after your wife has a baby. That is the most arbitrary statement I've literally ever heard. Like, it's based on absolutely nothing. So some people, very few, but some people are like, yeah, 3-4 weeks later, if I get the okay from my doctor, my cervix is closed, like happy having sex. But a lot of people after they give birth actually want to wait longer than 6 weeks, especially if there were complicating factors in the birth, if there was a C-section, if there was any sort of perineal tearing, if there are stitches, if you have a complicated baby, right? And so the conversation that I ask couples to have ahead of time is, how long could you go without physical intimacy where you're not questioning your importance or questioning your connection? And for some couples, it's like, yeah, we could ride this out for 3 months, for 6 months. We love each other. We're good in the like emotional support category. And for some people, they really are dependent on that physical connection. And so I just say, figure out what your date is, or, this 6 weeks out, 10 weeks out, 12 weeks out. And then that is when you have to put a giant block on your calendar to give someone, babysitter, a doula, grandma, your baby, and go and spend time with your partner. You don't have to resume physical intimacy, but it means that's how long you guys can go where you're prioritizing baby parent land. And now you've got to recommit to your partnership. So I will just say I hate the idea of date nights for any parent who has a kid under 2. So don't be like, hey, we're going to go to dinner. You're tired. Baby's at a cranky hour. So, Saturday dates during the day before 4 o'clock are a wonderful window where you and your partner should spend some time
Oh,
together.
yeah, that's a good idea. That's a really good idea. Do a date during the day. Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah.
Well, I wish I didn't know that, but I knew how to help my wife count to 8 and breathe. Can you please? You've addressed a few myths. Can you confirm that it's a myth that you can not get pregnant when you're breastfeeding? Is that a myth?
Oh,
Yep, that's number 3 for us. But we know how to breathe.
Oh,
That
honey.
wasn't addressed in the class either. That's okay. That's all right. I love my 3rd child. Happy that our 3rd child's here. But please.
Okay, well, let me just say why for listeners.
And that was even before Facebook and all the crap that you see there. But anyway, go ahead, Ashley.
Okay, so female bodies menstruate, or sorry, they ovulate before menstruation.
Okay.
And ovulation, sometimes, like if you have somebody who's very cued into their cycles, you can tell when you're ovulating. But while you're breastfeeding and you have a tiny baby, it's very hard to tell the first time you ovulate. You don't know until you have your first period. And then after you have your first period, then you go back into the ovulation menstruation cycle. So like breastfeeding can be, but particularly exclusive breastfeeding around the clock, like every 2 hours for 24 hours a day, as soon as the baby starts separating their feeds, then your hormones are getting the signal that like you could have another baby, right? And you're ready.
Thanks, Ashley. Fine. That's
But
great.
no, you can absolutely start ovulating while you're breastfeeding and get pregnant without knowing that is coming.
Just God,
you're
where
learning
were you
so
22
much
years
right now.
ago? Oh, yes. Yes, I am.
It's too late, maybe, but
Well, okay, so Bruce, to follow up on the earlier question too, the sort of framework, philosophy, method, the other thing I want to bring into this conversation is fair play, which you guys know a little bit about, and some of your listeners will know about, but
yeah.
We use in our marriage. Yeah, we love it. And I think Bruce, do you use any of it?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Big
fair
play.
I trained with the Fair Play crew in the first cohort. I think it was in 2021 when they trained Fair Play facilitators, partially because I was like, oh, I'm already doing so much of this thinking about equal partnership and about bringing men in, and I really want to know what the Fair Play language is bringing to the table. And so we've just started making that more explicit at Birthsmarter, is that every class, whether it's a childbirth education class or a newborn care class or a lactation class, every class focuses on what the mental load is of this side of parenting or this thing, right? Like birth preparation, and then how you can sort of equally distribute who's thinking about what. And so one of the biggest examples that we use in our newborn care classes is around diapering. Like we have a generation of dads who are so ready to change diapers. Like for the most part, they're sort of psyched about it. They're like, yeah, I got it. I'm going to be like on it.
Yeah.
And you master the sort of, like same with swaddling, you master those moves. Yeah. And what I often challenge people to think about is you being like the default diaperer is awesome. But what's more awesome is you thinking about what diapers you're using, because you've done the research to understand the brands and the sales and all of that. And you're monitoring your baby's growth to know when you need to size up from a size 1 to a size 2. It also means that you know where in your house you're storing the diapers. So have you done the organization of the sort of extra closet to make room for them? And are you restocking the diaper table and restocking the diaper bag when you know you're going to need new diapers, right? And then this is a reach, but I would argue that if you're in charge of diapers, you're the one who's doing the research on potty training, and you're going to be getting your family ready to move out of diapers. into whatever potty training method you're going to use. And then thinking about like, okay, wait, does that extend into when your kid wets the bed for 4 years, like in my house? Are you also then the person changing the sheets? Because that's sort of still in the diapering area.
Yeah.
And like every family gets to make their own choice, but there is a difference between the eagerness we see dads have around like doing one of the tasks of parenting versus addressing, okay, how am I going to take on this thinking that has historically always fallen on mom?
I'm glad you brought up the mental load, and I can't stress enough the importance of companies, managers, anybody within a system recognizing that we need good, strong, paid parental leave, that both partners need to take time away from work, quality time, not the 3 days I had, but weeks, in order to be able to free your mind so you can now kind of absorb all the new mental load tasks that you have in caregiving. And when I say you can absorb, I mean both partners, not just one. And traditionally, it's women who often absorb those. Not always. And I don't. We didn't have that, and I think because we were time scarce, like most of that fell on her. But I also think part of it is because the way that I cope with stress is, when it comes to our family, is I go straight into providing. And providing, if you're a listener, you know that there's many ways to provide, like, right? So managing the mental load in your house, that's a way to provide. Providing emotional support, that's a way to provide. So in this context, what I'm saying is financially provide. And I instantly went into, like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to buy a duplex, rent one side out, live in the other, because we were really young. Here's what we're doing with our investments here. And I immediately went into, I got to work more, make more, save more. And I think that a lot of that was me coping with stress, anxiety, because whenever I feel stress and anxiety, I instantly turn to that. And when I say, like, when it comes to like spending money in those moments, I have physical responses. I have migraine headaches. It's really hard on me. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's important that couples know how to manage the kinds of stress that comes with having a child, not just in the ER or in the hospital, but in the months and the years that follow. What strategies do you recommend?
Well, I think that the micro version of what we talk about there, we throw one sort of like kind-hearted grenade to couples in class. And so they're like in a newborn care class, right? They're like learning how to diaper and think about baby sleep and all of that. And one of the questions we'll ask, and this is primarily for first timers, right? So if you've had 3 babies, you're gonna sort of know your default pattern here. But what we ask first timers is, if your baby is, nursing or they're drinking a bottle, and you can tell that eating is like getting them into what's going to be a really good deep sleep. Their body is relaxing, their fists are like opening up, and they're just going to like conk out. And right as that happens, as they release into sleep, you hear just a huge poo, right? Like the diaper is exploding, and like the sound quiets. They have had this like great bowel movement, and they drop into the heaviness of sleep. What do?
Oh, you just let
And
them sleep? Are you kidding me? Good God, you do not wake that baby up. Go ahead. Sorry, I did
right,
not mean to respond that emotionally, but
yeah.
hold
So
on, hold
right
on.
when
Yeah, I'm right, correct? I'm right. Please tell me I'm right.
All right, so there's 2 answers, right? One is there's no
Okay.
right answer, and it
Okay.
depends, because if you have a baby that has really severe diaper rash, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Then you got to change their diaper, right? So
Uh,
there's what we always say is that there's personal context, and you can't compare yourself to anybody else.
okay.
For me as a parent with babies who did not have diaper rash, I absolutely always let them sleep. Yeah, because I think surviving parenting is about doing the least work possible. And when you do the least work possible, you're still completely and totally overwhelmed.
Well, I had one guest on that said the key to parenting is low expectations for yourself.
100%.
But
100%.
this goes back to your point, like we're not following like an exact recipe book, right? Like we have to be adaptable. We have to be flexible. Like we have to use the salt, fat, acid, heat cookbook like mentality of like these are the different components we can use.
Absolutely.
We have to look at what's right for our baby, our kid, our situation.
And so the question, when we throw that to couples, it's really interesting because 9 out of 10 of them have a difference of opinion sitting in our class, right? And it is the first time they've been asked to think critically about what they would do in a what if situation. All the other parts of planning for your birth and your baby are like, do you like this stroller or this stroller, right? Where there's just like, okay, here's a finite choice. And so I think that making the choice about are we going to let the baby sleep or not is the same choice about, wait, are we going to buy this house or not? It's like when you actually, and this is what I love about fair play, when you actually have to dive into the why behind the decision you're making and behind your perspective, right? Is like, I totally 100% think that parenting would be easier without a co-parent. Like, I don't want to get divorced, but if I got divorced, I would be like a great mom.
Okay. So in all seriousness, I was talking about this with a friend the other day, like in the old school, well, I mean, I'll just say the way I was raised, my mom set the rules. It was that was it. And so if I went to my dad and asked my dad, can I, whatever, my dad would like, go ask your mom. And I know a lot of people will look at that and they will be like, well, you're shouldering her with all the mental load. Now, I'm going to push back on that a little bit because my mom loved it because whatever she said went, they were always on the same page. And it was really simple because my dad just got my mom's back. So my mom made the choice. She didn't have to go have a conversation with my dad. And if I disobeyed, then like my mom didn't have to like really do anything. She'd just be like, go upstairs until your dad gets home. And it's like, I'm going to get a whooping. So it was really, that's probably, I guess you don't do that in 2024 according to doctors, but it worked for my parents. And the simplicity of that was effective. Is that the right way to co-parent today? Probably not. I'm going to post this and I'm going to get lots. I'm going to be canceled for saying these things. I need to say, I don't spank my kids. I don't co-parent like that. We actually have conversations, to be clear. We're on the same page. I shoulder a fair amount of the mental load, but all I'm trying to do as I'm digging myself out of this grave, Ashley, is show you that I agree with you that parenting can be simple if you just simply are the one who's making the decision.
Yeah, I mean, it's exhausting, right? Like, it's not hard enough to make this decision about your kid when you're sleep deprived, when you're stressed, when the form that you had to fill out was due 2 days ago when you didn't know, when you found it at the bottom of the backpack, or you can't register for camp because you don't have your vaccine records or whatever it is. But so the navigating it with another human is really, really, really complicated.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of times I feel like my husband's perspective is like ankle weights, right? But he also, to your point, he's involved now too, for better or worse. And so like my opinion is ankle weights for him. And so we are continuing to work towards the dividing and conquering in the fair play land, because then I think you can have the benefit of what you had growing up, right? Where I can say, if my kid comes to me with a homework issue, like, go ask your dad, he has homework. I don't know. I don't touch that, right? Because I don't think we can all hold space for everything if there's another voice involved. Like single parents, of course, they're holding space for everything, right? But a relationship is a lot to manage in and of itself.
Right.
So the fact that you are parenting with this other person while you are also trying to love this other person and have healthy communications with that person and have physical intimacy with that person, make sure that person is seen and supported and making money and feeling fulfilled, is like, oh, how are we doing any of this without really cutting up and dividing and conquering who's doing what, and then trusting each other to do that well?
And I have to say, my youngest is 16, so we've kind of gone through this journey for, 22 years now when you look at the age of my oldest child. And there are two things that I've learned. One that was said really simply and well by Paige O'Connell is that the default answer when your kids ask for something is no. And then you go talk to your spouse, because it's a heck of a lot easier to go back and be like, we changed our mind. And the second, and this is what I've learned, and I was told this by my parents, and it's the most important advice I can provide. You always get your partner's back. Do not ever, you have to be one, because if your kids find a chink in the armor, you're done for. And it leads to so many problems and fights and stresses, et cetera. So what little experience I have, you're the expert, Ashley, but what little experience I have is that you've got to be on the same page and get each other's back. But we have to come to a conclusion with one simple piece of actionable advice that you want to share with our listeners that will make this whole birthing process easier for them.
Okay, but I'm going to say two.
All right,
So one is really small, but my good friend Jake, he facilitates a dad's group with me. His advice, I just want to share it on the podcast, is when you head into the hospital, the number one things that dads need to have with you is an extra pair of socks. Like if you forget absolutely everything else about what you needed to bring, it's like you're going camping, right? If you
right.
you get stuck for 2, 3, 4 days, your baby ends up in the NICU, whatever, you can throw some water, rinse your mouth out, but the clean socks is going to give you a fresh start on life. So that's our super actionable piece of advice from Jake. And then mine, honing in on the specificity of this episode, is for people who are going in to have babies. I think that if you're supporting your partner or your wife in labor, the number one thing I would love you to do is find someone, your college roommate, your best man, your sister, your mom, doesn't have to be another man, but pick one person and explicitly ask them to be in your corner from the minute she goes into labor until 2-3 days after, to be checking in on you, to have their phone with them so they can respond to texts, so that if something scary or sad happens, or if you get bored, you have somebody to call at 3 a.m. and they are going to ride it out with you. Because thinking that you can fully and completely show up for your partner and then show up for your baby without knowing that someone is holding you is totally irrational and is going to backfire.
That's really great advice, which I could have used instead of the breathing class. Ashley, thank you so much for your wisdom today. We are going to share this far and wide. And if you listened and you know somebody that is going through the birthing process right now, please share this with them. A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach. And join your fellow modern husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every 2 weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.